All right, so this was one final practice that I had about graphing. If you recall, last week we scored ourselves on earning points on graphs. There were like 5 different things that I went over. So this was just one more practice problem. So this is sample data. A student, she wants to run 15 kilometers. Every 30 minutes, she checks her pedometer to see how far she's gone. So the first thing they ask, and this one's a little weird, but the first thing they ask is her dependent variable. And it's kind of weird because a lot of people looked at time and they didn't feel like time is really an independent variable because it's not really what she changed. However, if she's recording the distance, this is her data here. So this data that she's recording, the distance she traveled, would be her dependent variable. And that would make time her independent variable. So the times were sort of set, and then her measurements, her data, was the distance that she traveled. So which goes on the x-axis, independent or dependent? I heard one person, I think. Independent goes on our x-axis. So our independent variable should be down here, and that is going to be the time. So I'm going to label this time and in parentheses minutes. Just a reminder that if you forget to put your units, they will not give you credit. They will assume it will be as just the same as if you didn't label it at all. So time in minutes, and then that would make this over here her distance. And again, you would need to include the units of kilometers. The other thing is, you'll notice that I made a scale. I had a student in one of my classes that took the total distance data, and they basically just did this. They said, okay, so my total distance, and they put like 6.8, 10.1, 12, 13.3, and 15, and they basically equally spaced the data. You can't do that. You need to create a scale, and then wherever the data falls in that scale. Does that make sense? In other words, don't take your data points and make that your scale. What you should do is take your highest data point, make sure that your scale goes that high, but notice that this is in increments of 5. If I do this, they're not even increments between my data, so you don't want to do that. If you do that, you're going to get a straight line no matter what, if you actually do your data that way. All right, so I created a scale. So another thing that this graph would need is a title. So you could just put, it doesn't really matter. Distance traveled, I'll just put over 150 minutes. Some kind of a title. So we've got 1 point for the title. You would get 1 point for putting the correct thing on the correct axis. In other words, time on the x and your distance on the y. Then you would have gotten a point for correctly labeling. Should this be a line graph or a bar graph? This should be a line graph. We have numbers for both axes, so this is going to be a line graph. And so then you would have gotten a point for properly making a line graph and properly graphing that data, not extending beyond the last point. Somebody in one of my classes was concerned. They didn't know, is it okay to label past the data points? In other words, since she only went up to 15 kilometers, yes, it's absolutely okay to continue labeling 20, 25. That's not a problem. You just can't graph your data past that point. So since the last piece of data she has is at 150 minutes, and she was at 15, which is about here, when you make your line, and then people were concerned, does it need to be a line of best fit? And I'm not overly concerned about a line of best fit. This actually doesn't make a line of best fit anyway. If you graph this data, it kind of does this. It kind of makes a curve, which is fine. And you can connect the dots. It's okay. Lines of best fit, it would be nice if you could make things into a smooth line, but it doesn't matter. You don't want to go past 150. It's okay if these labels go past 150, but your line shouldn't go past 150. Do you remember what you are allowed to do if you were going to predict? Right, you could. It would be okay if you did some kind of a dotted line to predict where you thought that she would continue to go. You also cannot use, you know how we talked about that you don't have to start a graph at 0, 0, and that you could make like little breakpoints? You can't do that. You can't make a breakpoint in the middle of a line. In other words, our first data point here is 0, 0. So you don't want to make some kind of a breakpoint in the middle of where your line would be. It would be okay if the first data point you had was at 30 minutes to make a breakpoint and have your data start at 30 minutes. But you can't make a breakpoint in the middle of a line. So that would be something that you would not want to do. And let's see. Line graph, title, correct axis, labeling. There was a fifth thing. And now I can't remember what it was. That's all right. Questions 3 and 4 at the top. Common thing they do on the AP exam. Very, very common thing they do. They will ask you to make a prediction. So this says, how many kilometers had Natalie run after 40 minutes? You don't have that actual data. So what they're looking for you to do is, from your graph, come up with some kind of a logical estimate, which I know my graph isn't to scale. But here's the deal. There won't be one exact numerical correct answer. It would be logical to assume that it's got to be somewhere between, if it's 30 minutes she had gone 6.8 and at 60 minutes she had gone 10.1, they would probably accept any answer between 7 and 9 would be an acceptable answer. Something that's logical, that it would make sense that she would have run somewhere in there. If it's a fill-in question, make sure, so let's say that I estimate she had run 7, that you include your units. Because again, if you leave out the units, it's just like you didn't answer the question. So if I'm predicting she had run about 7 kilometers, then just make sure that you put the kilometers. If it's a grid-in question, which is something that they have on the AP exam, then the units won't matter, because you'll literally be bubbling in a numerical answer, and the units won't make a difference, because you'll just be writing in the number. The last question, I include it because another common thing they'll do on the AP exam, even though you're actually given a formula sheet, is that they will give you a formula for something that you've never seen before. Now, I understand most of you know that the formula for speed is distance over time. But they'll give you a unique formula. Scientists calculate such and such using the following formula. And they'll tell you what all the variables mean. And then they'll give you some data and ask you to use the formula and calculate an answer to see that you understand how to use a formula you've never seen before. That you could take data, and if the formula is explained to you, you could plug numbers in. In my other class, a lot of people got question number 4 wrong because they didn't pay really close attention to a discrepancy. They asked for her speed in kilometers per hour, but what is the data collected in? Minutes, not hours. So before you could give the answer to question number 4, you would need to convert your minutes to hours. So she ran for 150 minutes. How do we convert from minutes to hours? Exactly. So you could, I can write it in pretty dimensional analysis. I know how much you missed that from chemistry. But basically, if you divide your minutes by 60, you would get how many hours there were, which I believe comes out to 2.5. Sorry, this is really getting a little sloppy here. So her time was 2.5 hours. Her distance was 15 kilometers. So she would go 15 kilometers over 2.5 hours. And if you divide that out, you would get a speed of 6 kilometers per hour. Another thing they will do on the AP exam, I mentioned this to you before, is they will actually tell you exactly where they want you to round. So they would say round to the nearest whole number, or if it was something that was not going to give you a whole number, they might say round to the nearest tenth. So they'll tell you exactly where they want you to round off. All right, and I think I remember now the last point on this was for putting the correct variable on the correct axis. The fact that you put time on the x and distance on the y. That would have been the last point there. When we take our test, there will be some kind of data, and I'll ask you to make a graph of it, and I will score it exactly the same way that this is. You will get your points specifically, for remembering a title, the right kind of graph, making some kind of scale that makes sense. And you may be asked to plug some numbers into a formula, but you will be provided with the formula. There's almost no formulas that you have to memorize for the AP exam. They give them to you. You just have to know how to plug numbers into them. So, any questions about about this. Like I said, I know our class was a little behind, but I wanted to go over it. I didn't want to just skip it. Okay.